Hello, and welcome to Temple of the False Pod, where our decks are not optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. I'm Andy.
I'm Bruce.
And we are going to talk about precons today because I think that you and I are the utmost experts when it comes to pre-constructed commander decks.
Right up there.
There's not a single person who's better at this.
At buying precons?
At buying precons, yeah.
That might be a big statement, but...
I love precons. I mean, it was the reason I wanted to bring this up as a topic was more or less because I think that they're a really good starting point for... I mean, obviously, the precon commander decks are a really good spot for wizards to put cards into the everything that they can't find good place for in like any normal set. But I think that like it does a really good job, obviously, of like reprints for one, and two, just getting non-commander players or even non-magic players into not only the game but into the game's largest format. With that, I think it's like a really good spot to show people the world of casual Magic.
And I sort of agree with that statement.
Mm-hmm.
In that I agree with new players who are new to Magic. If you're introducing them to Commander, then a precon is a great way to start because you're taking away that whole forced level of deck building. And I think in Commander, especially now, forcing a player to learn how to play Magic and learn how to build a deck all at once, that's a lot to ask for, especially when you consider the average power level of a deck nowadays.
Yeah.
And we are definitely going to talk about that. I think it makes it very hard for players to break into the format or just into the game without having a deck essentially handed to them that can have a decent game where you can actually play and have fun.
Yeah. And I think for me too, like when I started playing, you've got almost 30,000 cards to work with. And obviously some of them are absolutely unplayable. But even just getting your mind wrapped around the restrictions of archetypes, like what cards or for lack of a better term, staples do you generally want, or facsimiles of certain staples,
right?
The idea behind the card rather than the actual card. And I think that precons do a good job of displaying this is how much removal you want and this is how much land you want. I mean, they fluctuate somewhere between 36 and 40 land generally on most precons, and I feel like if you were to ask a seasoned Magic player or a seasoned Commander player, a lot of them just be like, well, it depends, and you've got all these factors, and like if you're talking to a new player to the game, it becomes overwhelming extremely fast, and you'll get a lot of like misleading information, and not even necessarily like intentionally misleading, but a lot of like, oh well, like you want to start at 40 and then you can take away lands for every 3 mana rocks you put in, or like every 3 mana sources, and it's just like, well,
that's
like,
just way too deep,
right? And it just becomes overwhelming very fast. And the thing with precons that shine so brightly is the fact that they are built, and they are built with new mechanics in mind and new all these things, and also displaying how to package it all together. One of the things that I like too about the precons is that they generally do come with like a playing guide, like, hey, this is what the deck's about, this is how it's structured, and this is going to be your play pattern for most of the game.
Right.
I love the idea of precons, so that's kind of why I wanted to bring it into the royal, as it were.
Right. I like the precons. I mean, obviously I do. Up until just before the pandemic, I was essentially buying every precon that came out. For me, as an experienced Commander player, I wasn't buying them because I wanted the deck. I mean, I would keep the deck together long enough to play 2 games with it, and then immediately pull it apart because I wanted the parts. And
right.
At that, early on, if you wanted those Commander cards, the best way to get them was to buy the deck. And I was happy to buy the deck and play a couple of games. And if it meant that I picked up a handful of cards that I didn't want or wasn't planning to use, Well, that was fine too. It didn't. That part didn't bother me so much, just because it was a preset set of cards. I wasn't at that point willing to. A lot of times it would just be easier, and oftentimes even cheaper, especially early on, with some of the decks, to just buy the deck as opposed to
because you know what you're getting.
Yeah, as opposed to buying a handful of the new cards that you wanted. You just buy the entire deck. It was just easier that way, and like I said, it was oftentimes cheaper to do it that way. At least early on. See, I'm one of the few people that liked the early precons. The problem with the early precons was that they just weren't good decks. The mana base was generally bad, but I'm not going to complain because I also wanted the cards. So, if you're going to short me 4 basics, well, that would be just fine. I can live with the fact that the 2 games I'm going to play with this deck mean that it's not going to play particularly well. The thing with the early decks was the decks weren't particularly good because they came with a handful of commanders, and it seemed like there was like a little package of cards in each of the decks that worked really well with that commander. And then there was a different commander that was in the same deck. It was sort of fit the theme of your actual commander, but not really. And then that card also had 10 cards to it. So you'd play the deck, and oftentimes you were looking at the card going like, well, this might make sense if I had the other guy as my commander, but for this guy, it's no good, or it's not as good as it should. So this meant a lot of people looked at these decks and said, these are lousy commander decks. I'm like, well, yeah, but they're really good bones for a new player who now has 3 commanders that they can build. Because you now have the core for each of those 3 commander decks. And then you go out and you buy singles and expand on each of those decks, and you can make each one of them far better than the one you started with. But you get to use all of these cards and all of these ideas. It isn't just, here is the deck, you should improve this deck. Well, you're not improving the deck, you're pulling it into, like I said, 2 or 3 separate decks, and then adding to that. And I like the way that worked out. I felt like it was a great way to introduce new players because you're giving them more options. You want them to build more decks, and you give them more variety, as opposed to, it's like, oh look, everybody now has this one deck. Let's see who goes out and buys the singles to make that one deck better. Like, well, that's great, and I appreciate the downside that, for a new player who's only going to buy that one commander deck, that it's going to be a weak deck. But the point isn't to get them to buy that one deck. The point is to get them to buy that first deck, play it a couple times, get hooked on the game, and then realize, oh, I can pull these apart. If you've got a 3-color deck, you can now build 2-color decks in all the options because there was a commander that could work for all of them.
Yeah, I think that's one of my favorite things about the precons themselves is obviously the expandability. You can take pieces out, put pieces in, make it your own,
right,
and really have it shine with your personality. But I think that it's just like a great starting point, even just for collection's sake. Mm-hmm. And I think that obviously you mentioned the land base, and it's gotten a little better. There's a lot of like, oh, come into land, gain 1 life. Like, sure, okay. Come in tapped, gain 1 life. Like, sure.
The land base has definitely gotten better. But I attribute that primarily to the decks themselves have just gotten better.
Yeah.
I mean, the current deck now, I really feel like it is built around the commander. You can use an alternate commander, but I don't think it's going to be as good as if you just use the commander they recommend. And the entire deck is streamlined around that one commander. I mean, there are pros and cons to that, but I did like the idea that you could split them up. And if it meant the power level was a little lower, I was okay with that too, because I also think that the commander decks are getting a little too powerful, but we'll talk about that in a bit.
I think, and I think that they can generally be grouped pretty well into a couple different eras of precons. I mean, we obviously have like the original couple sets of commanders, which would come out every year. You'd have 4 or 5 commanders come out in a year. It's like $60 a commander, or $60 a deck, and that was it. Like, or maybe less. I don't remember.
Oh, it was way less.
Oh, okay. I wasn't around then. But, you'd have, the handful of decks that would come out. And those are the ones you're talking about. And then, they start to ramp up. And then sometimes they're set entwined. And then we got to War of the Spark, and things kind of, like, Wizards finally caught on to that commander is... I mean, they caught on way before this, but...
well, that's when we finally started seeing it in the precons.
Right. We started seeing precons kind of churned out on a quarterly basis. I mean, we would see them, like... That was kind of the point where, I mean, the next 2 sets were Kaldheim and Zendikar Rising, and those two sets both had 2 commander decks each at $20 a piece. And they were, I mean, obviously lower powered and very heavily themed in those worlds, which was like a really cool idea. And I love when they make ancillary products that are grouped in with the rest of what's going on in Magic, rather than just like, oh yeah, and then there's Aminatou, who is here now, and like it was kind of near when we were in Dominaria, but not super like.
Right, and I will say, when we got to that point, I really didn't like it. I didn't like the idea that it was so tied to the set. I felt like it was too restrictive. I didn't feel like you were getting the range of cards. Like, I still wanted to see. I still felt like at that point, these commander precons were the primary source of a way to get the older Magic cards that you didn't already have. So when they started tying it so closely to the sets as they were released, I found it to be it was much harder, like, how am I supposed to be getting these older cards if you're tying it so closely to the newer stuff? And I completely get why they did it. It just makes sense. You want to sell the newer cards. You're not, if you're Wizards, you're not that worried about the older stuff that are being sold as singles on the secondary market when you're not making any money doing that. But it was then at that point when they started following that up with Commander Legends. It's like, oh, okay, now you have another way to produce any of the older cards in a quantity that's sizable enough that it can actually affect the cost of it on the market. And then the idea of tying the focus of the commander decks to whatever set that it's being released with started to make more sense. And I was like, okay, I'm good with that, because you don't want to have 2 years go by and have them not even have the opportunity to print a card because it just doesn't fit with the current theme of the world that they're printing their commander deck with. So.
And I'm growing more and more fond of this integrated commander set type thing. And I think that maybe because I'm finally around to like understanding that I don't need to buy every precon, or I don't even need to buy a precon from each time they release precons. But I think that they found a good balance of obviously reprint value, but it's not so much like noob territory for precons, because I think the precons for Kaldheim and Zendikar were really cool ideas, and I think that they had some really good synergies within them that were made the decks almost very geared toward the new player base, which is always good, because I mean, this was just after War of the Spark came out. This was like their first commander product after War of the Spark came out, which was about the time of Avengers Endgame. So like, those two like monumental things happening simultaneously kind of saw this huge rush of people into the game. So like it makes sense that they would make an easy product to sell at $20 and just kind of get it on the shelves and all this stuff. But now they're starting to like ramp up value in obviously reprints. They're ramping up just value in terms of honing in on design space. But I love that these have kind of taken over the spot for like the Planeswalker decks, for instance. Like I did like the Planeswalker decks for what they were, but I feel like there were too many cards that were too specific to those decks that just didn't do anything unless, like, if you tried to put them in another deck, it would be garbage. And so, like, having the Commander product kind of take that place found a very interesting balance that they had to toe in terms of, like, making it interesting for, obviously, new players who have never heard of this game, but also players who have been playing and want something to catch their eye.
Yeah. I mean, for me, with the way the Commander decks went, or the precons, initially you had this low power level multi-commander deck. So you can swap out your decks and do that. And they did that for a while. And then they started to ramp up the power. But at that time, Wizards decided that this is an eternal format. You can't just make the creatures more powerful to make people want to buy them, because you're just making more powerful cards. They printed Arcane Signet, and then someone said, "Oh, wait a second! We can't be doing this, because this is not repeatable. Like, you can't make, like, if that's what you're going to do, then the next Arcane Signet has to cost 1 mana. Where do you go to convince people to buy the new card? You have to make it more powerful." So what they were doing for us an extended period of time was building decks with a commander that was extremely niche, was super focused in one tiny area, so they could ramp up the power, because it was in such a narrow area. You really had to build, like, the entire deck has to absolutely revolve around this one card to really make the deck hum. And so they were upping the power level, but in really narrow areas. And then we shifted, and it started getting very closely tied with each of the sets as they came out. And I feel like they've moved away from these super narrow commanders and shifted more into precons that are tied to the deck, but they're pushing, they're willing to push the power level to get people to buy the decks. And I don't feel like the new commanders are particularly narrow. I mean, and then I say that, and of course, then you get the mutate ability. So of course, as soon as I say this, then there's a mutate deck, which, totally fights everything I'm saying up to this point. But it just, the power level in the decks went up. Because the power level was just going up. So it went up on these decks as well. And then I feel like that's sort of where we're at now.
Yeah.
And now we're starting to see, like, I suspect that Warhammer 40K is the first of many where we're going to see, a set of decks focused around a particular universe that isn't going to be tied to any set. So I'm hoping in the future what they do is they use a lot of reprints with new art. You could even just, change the name of the card, because I don't want to see them ramp the power through the roof. It's just, you can't go back. You don't get to go back. You make that mistake, it's there forever. I mean, arcane signets in any deck that has more than one color.
For
mana.
sure.
And even in decks that only produce one color, sometimes it's still there because it's a 2 mana rock. So, you really can't make mistakes on the high end of the power level when you've got an eternal format. So it gets a little tricky. But
I think the best thing they did. I think the best thing they did with Arcane Signet is realize that it was a mistake, so they decided to just reprint it into the ground. Because I mean, I think they really should have kind of stuck it in every precon at that point. But I mean, they reprinted it enough in, the Commander Legends, and Commander Legends 2 that I think it's finally down from a few dollars, where it should be. But I mean, like the past couple of years have been fairly high powered in terms of the commander decks, kind of starting with the C21 like Strixhaven decks, because I mean, like I said, we had the Kaldheim and we had the Zendikar decks, and then they kind of got back into the big commander decks rather than just kind of like almost intro-y kind of things, where C21 was the yearly commander product, and these decks did some crazy things. Granted, they were also trying to shake up the color pairing like identities with Strixhaven, and these decks did some really, really cool and powerful things, but also like didn't super make it super cheap to do these things. Like, it did big boisterous things for a fair price, for the most part. There were some decks that obviously were more powerful than the others, but I think that going forward from that point, we have these, a bit more powerful decks, through, I mean, your new Capenna decks are pretty good, pretty powerful. Your what are the ones? My favorites were the Battle for Baldur's Gate decks, because not only did they do big things at fair prices, they really leaned into the fun of it all, the wild plays rather than just the efficiency. And I think that was like a really good spot where they had the decks. And we'll talk a little bit about where they might be going with these decks going forward. But I mean, like you said, the Warhammer decks could be either a good or a bad sign. But we gotta throw it to break, and when we get back, we'll talk about those decks and what we see planned for the rest of the year. So we'll be right back.
This episode of Temple of False Pod is brought to you by a card that has shown up in as many Commander Precons as I think there are Precons. Temple of the False God. Go with your mana base, folks.
Okay, we're back.
All right.
Welcome. We're talking about pre-constructed commander decks today, because everybody needs a good place to start. And you know what? I always get them because I feel like they're obviously, like we were talking about, good places to start decks, but I feel like they also give you kind of good inspiration for other decks you're either working on or in the future. I feel like they're just like a good boost of inspiration, at least for me. So
right. Yeah, I think so. A lot of what I like from the precons, as somebody who has a lot of decks and has been playing Magic for a while, I like looking at at all the other legendary creatures, and thinking about how I can build the deck around that creature that's going to be different from the precon itself. Because I want a little variety or something, or make a little change and do a little alteration. I love that stuff. I think that's kind of what I look for out of one of the things I look for out of the precons. The other one, obviously, is staples. And quite often the precon will hold, will give you a new card that's essentially just better than your staple. It just makes an improvement on it in some little way, and and then that will get me wandering down that road, figuring out what other cards are a little bit better than the staple that I've been using in decks for a while. So,
right, yeah, and we more or less took a history drive down history memory lane. It's good enough.
Yeah.
And we kind of got to present day. I was talking about the C21, the Strixhaven decks, and then we had, even most recently with the New Capenna decks and the Neon Dynasty decks, they all were fairly well powered, but they seemed at least well balanced against each other, and I think that the design team did a really good job of seeing them in the lens of one another. Even if they were a little bit more powerful than, say, our meta, they held their own against each other, which was good. And now we've got, things like the any of the D&D commander decks I love, and we're starting to finally see universes beyond commander decks with the 40,000 decks. And something I found while researching this episode is that December we're getting starter commander decks. There's not much information out there as of now for what this means, but we've got 5 decks coming out based around, I believe they're all 2-color. Yeah. So they're all based around 2-color pairings.
Right.
We've got an Azorius around... what it seems also is that these are all completely reprints, but that's just based on assumption.
Right.
Because the commanders themselves are already cards.
Yeah, if they were going to have cards that weren't reprints, you would think that the commander that would lead them would be a brand new card as opposed to
right.
a copy. So this very much feels like it's going to be 100% reprint.
So we've got Azorius around Asperia, Supreme Judge. It's 6/4 for 6. I'm not going to read the card. We've got Gisa and Grolf, which is the Dimir, black-blue. 4/4 for 4. Does some stuff with zombies. Called Grave Danger. Oh yeah, the Asperia one's called First Flight, so it's probably going to be around flying creatures.
What?
We've got Carter Doomscourge, who I most recently made a deck around.
Yes.
In our season finale from last season. He's a 4/3 for 4 that goads things. The deck's called Chaos Incarnate, so it's probably going to be a bunch of goading things, probably a bunch of random pulls, maybe a Tali type effects where you're playing other people's cards, or who knows? We'll see. Some real chaos shenanigans. We've got Atarka World Render all the way back from, I don't know, Worldwake, who's the Gruul for, it's a 6/4 for 7. It seems like it's going to be a dragon deck because it's called Draconic Destruction. And he really cares about dragons.
Yeah.
We've got Amara Soul of the Accord, a 2/2 for 2, called Token Triumph, making tokens because it's Selesnya from one of the most recent times we went to Ravnica. Thank you. So these decks, they seem fairly straightforward, and hopefully that they won't be so busted that they give new players the wrong idea of what this format should be. But I hope that they're not so garbage that they just they're a throwaway product,
Right.
It's a very fine line for them to toe. I want good reprint value, obviously. I want people who have been playing Commander to want to buy these, if only for a few of the reprints or whatever. But I also want new players to come in and understand what is going on in the format beyond, we've got Hull Breacher and stuff like that, where it's these overly powerful cards that do not fun things, and I hope they're fun, but I hope they're not all just, bulk rares.
Right. Yeah, I'm hoping for something that's I don't want them to create a new series of commander decks that are, that they're not creating a level where it's starter in both cost, in power level, so they can justify continuing to charge,
right,
between $60 to $80 for a commander deck. That that commander players who've been playing a while will want. Because I don't want them to create an excuse that they're just they've got their tiers and they're going forward that way.
I would love to see these in the Kaldheim range of $20 to $30. Have some cool synergies, do some cool things, have some very specific cards that you could find a niche for in some of your decks, and then the rest of it just kind of be oh yeah, this is just whatever. But I could easily see this being it's exactly what you'd expect for $20 of random BS.
Right.
And I think that the $20 to $30 price point could also do really well with a lot of the seasoned commander players of if this is a good product that seasoned commander players want to buy, it could sell out.
Well, I don't think it's going to, because I have a strong suspicion that this is something that's going to be, filling up the shelves at Target and Walmart as we get closer to Christmas. So any of you who have folks who will buy you Magic related items for Christmas, don't be surprised to see one of these show up under the tree.
It's interesting too, because two of them are 6 and 7 mana drop commanders. Two of them are 4 drops, and one of them is a 2 drop.
Right.
And obviously, the 2 drop isn't great unless you have ways to tap it, other than combat. But I don't know, the 4 mana commanders are pretty fun.
Yeah. So, Andy, I have a question.
Yes.
If you've got a player who's brand new to Magic, do you start them with a precon? Is that where the brand new Magic player should start?
I think so. I think it's tough because there's precons on the internet all the way back to when precon started.
Right.
It's tough to show them where to start. But if they're new to Magic, I think that the way you introduced me to the game was really good, where we would play a few games of 60 card whatever, and then I played with one of your commander decks, and then I would play with people's commander decks that on Thursday nights until I made my own. But I think if I could go back, I would have started with I would have had my own precon. I think that they're an excellent place to start any player, even the recent ones. I think that the thing I would struggle with these decks is if they are piles of garbage, if they're not good, then they are either going to not excite new players into playing Commander,
right?
Or they're going to, if they're piles of garbage, nobody's going to pay attention to them. And then people are just going to go back in the years of okay, well, we have, your Neon Dynasty commanders, which are fine. They do a thing. And you've got your New Capenna commanders, which are extremely specific to the family's mechanics. You've got your Ikoria commanders, which are specific to those factions' mechanics, and I think that I don't know where I would start somebody.
Well, okay, so but what about the player who has played Magic, someone who's played one-on-one Magic, and that's it? When they come to Commander, where do you start them off? Do you just start them off with the rules and say, here, build the deck? Or do you start them, how would you introduce that person to Commander?
I think...
is it the precon?
Yeah, I mean, I think either way, whether they've been playing Magic for a while and they are a similar like play style to you or me, yeah, I'd probably introduce them to the precons to at least get a base of like, okay, like this is how, like, even if you know how to make a 60 card deck, like it's going to be a little bit more intensive to make a commander deck, if only because you have to find 6 cards that do the same thing,
Right.
Generally speaking. And then with new players, I think that the precons are a pretty good place to start, if only because like the same thing, like like building the deck is going to be the hard part in introducing anybody to a new format, because not only do you not have the basis for how much is actually out there for cards, but you don't have a basis for what is acceptable in the meta. And I think that that's kind of where I am interested to see where Wizards goes with these things, because I would hope that they would kind of take it upon themselves to direct people into the right area for what is casual and
Right.
that kind of thing.
See, now for me, a player who's brand new to Magic, then yeah, I'm okay with starting them with a commander deck. I might want to try and start them with a couple of the just the starter decks, give them the basics, and then graduate to a commander deck, just because commander decks can be an awful lot of cards doing an awful lot of different things. But a new player, yeah, I'm okay with the precon. For a player who's new to Commander but not Magic, I would more likely tell them to look at Commander Legends. Don't buy a couple of precons. Buy a box of Commander Legends. Mm-hmm. I think you get a big stack of cards that are all fairly Commander specific, and then they can build based on that, with the assumption that they already have basic build knowledge for building a 60 card deck, that if they can extrapolate that out, they should be fine. And I think that you're going to get a lot more cards, and it'll also allow you a lot more deck building variety for that player. I think
for sure.
I think you want to take the brand new player and put them more on rails. And I like the idea of, I'm not going to make you build a deck yet. Here, take this one. Let's avoid the how to build a deck discussion for now, and just play this so you learn how to play the game and are comfortable. And then we can start talking about how to, build your own deck and make changes to these decks and all this kind of thing. Yeah, I do love the Commander Legends sets. I think it's I think for somebody like me, I'm moving away from buying each of the Commander precons and moving more towards getting a box of Commander Legends, because I know I'm getting an entire box of Commander related cards, and I don't really need it to be built into a deck for me anymore. I'm not really looking for that. So it's it's sort of something that seems to have moved past me, not so much because the precons have moved past, but more a case of they're offering there's another option for somebody like me. So I'm, I'll spend my money there as opposed to on the precons.
Yeah. And I think the thing with a lot of these precons too is that, each of them come with a certain amount of brand new cards, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So like they're cards that are built with Commander in mind, and they are put into these decks and only these decks. I mean, they're snuck into some set boosters, but overall, like, everybody knows about these 10 cards, type of thing, where, you're going to see a lot of them over and over and over again because, like, say, Jessica's Will, for example. Obviously, that came out in Commander Legends, but it's reprinted in one of the more recent Commander decks, and, you see a lot of it, but they're, like, it just doesn't feel as exhilarating to play if everybody's got it, type of thing.
Right.
And where I've kind of started to shift my focus is a very similar thing, where I like to open... I mean, I obviously like to open packs. We've talked about this before. Not a great use of money, but If like you're going for certain cards in the precons and you don't really need all the other ones, like obviously you can just buy those singles. A lot of people are going to buy those specific singles like Jessica's Will or Dockside Extortionist. These types of cards that do come in precons that outlive the precons themselves. But then you've got, cards that you might not have thought of using that you just happen to get through pack.
Yeah.
I just have so much more fun just kind of going through the cards that I have and building, scrappy decks.
Right.
I get to learn how to pilot based on the meta rather than, the things that, like, I feel like so many precons, and I don't think this necessarily is the same for a majority of players, but maybe a majority of franchise players, is that they buy a precon, they play it, once or twice just to see, like, what does this do? Okay, cool. I spent money on this. Let's leave it up and play it. But then it just gets taken apart. And like, while that is good to get those cards into other decks and stuff and like use it more than you normally would.
I mostly agree with what you're saying. I will say though, when buying precons, it means I actually own a copy of Dockside.
Right.
And I own it because I was buying the precons. And I bought that precon along with all the others. And then Dockside went, took the price up to the point where Dockside is still more expensive than I would pay for the card. Even after getting reprinted in double masters in all its various forms and varieties, you're still looking at, as of recording, roughly $50 for the card. I'm just not paying $50 for that card. I'm just not going to do it. But it does mean that I do have one copy. I mean, and I felt the same way about some of the other major cards that came through some of the sets like that. But I hate to be, I also don't want to be the one buying a full set of precons just because I then luck into getting to keep that one card. That's not just not enough. It's not a good enough reason,
And for me, like, even Dockside, like, if the precon showed up for less than $50 at some point in the future, like on sale or something, I would still have a hard time buying the whole deck for that one card because, I mean, it's not the power level I want, Like, the cards that I want to play with aren't going to be those ones.
Right.
And I get playing with them. And sometimes, like, I mean, Dockside in our meta ends up being not as, like, crazy powerful as, like, you see it all the time of, like, being, churned through the graveyard over and over and over again.
Right.
But
yeah, and honestly, I don't know, even when it gets played, I mean, you get 5, sometimes 10 treasures at best, and usually there's no way to get rid of it and then bring it back. Yeah. So you're getting that one shot. Still a great deal for 2 mana. Great deal, but it's not quite as broken as it is in a lot of other metas. So
there's a certain charm for me in the precons where I feel like if they were always $20 to $30 of, like, okay cards, like the Call Time or the Zendikar or even the Innistrad commander decks, if they were all that level at, like, say even $30 a piece, like, I would be, like, charmed enough to sleeve them up, keep them on the shelf as they are. I feel like I could get a lot of use out of keeping them together.
Right.
And at this point, with commander decks, I am doing what we were just talking about, of, like, looking at the deck list, see if there's, like, cards that I want out of it that it would just be easier or better to acquire these cards by just buying the deck, and then moving on from there, like either breaking it apart or whatever.
Right.
But, I loved a lot of the C21 and beyond decks because they were so tied with the sets, but still like fairly powered.
Yeah.
That was kind of the sweet spot for me, even if it did seem like they were starting to creep up.
Yeah. With the precons, I think they have to be so careful. I am very nervous because I know that they want to create they want to create these decks that are going to sell. And the best way for them to make that happen is to just up power level. I mean, I do like the idea of put a different kind of art on it, do a different foil treatment, do a different kind of art treatment to the card without having to ramp up the power level so that people will still buy it because they want to get the funky new variant on the card. But the best way to sell cards is always going to be to make a cool card. So
for sure.
They just have to be watching that they're making cool cards and not necessarily cards that are cool because they're overpowered, piles of ridiculousness that will mess the format up in the years to come.
And I think for me, like, where they landed with a lot of the Battle for Baldur's Gate stuff, and we've talked about this on the show before, was like the perfect idea for like Commander going forward, for me at least, of like weird interaction stuff, like big plays, a little high cost, which was good.
Yes.
Because it didn't force people to make things efficient, and it didn't force people to like optimize their decks for these plays, but it still made it fun and worth the time and effort put in to do it. And I think if they used that philosophy toward precons, like precons could be bigger than they are. But I feel like right now people care about two things, whether like it's either they're new players and just want to find a good place to start playing Commander without having to worry too much about the deck building process, or they're enfranchised people who are just looking for reprint value, which like both are legitimate and fair. And obviously I'm not saying that's all who are looking at these products, because there are plenty of people who do the thing that I was just talking about, which is just buy them, keep them together, pull them out like at family game night or whatever, and just like play them against each other as they were built, And there's a huge spectrum of things, and nothing's ever binary, but it's. I think it would be really interesting to see them going forward with kind of broadcasting their ideas of what Commander should be. We're starting to slowly run out of time. Do you have any things that you want to see out of Commander decks going forward?
I want to see players get the opportunity to play on the lower tier. Mm-hmm. I think that precons are very much an introduction to a lot of players to the format, and as the precons get more powerful, the opportunity for the new player to play at a lower level, to play the game that takes 16 or 17 turns to develop, and they lose that because that precon is going to it becomes their base level. It's like, if the deck isn't as good as my precon, then it's no good. I need to scrap it and build something else.
Right.
And I would much rather see players come in, and if that's their attitude, then let's get these precons down to a lower power level, so that maybe the precons don't put up the good fight at every single table that you go to. It doesn't have to be that way. You can have them as a lower power level, and then let these newer players enjoy building all kinds of weird and funky decks and trying out other things, and then discovering, okay, well, I can, if my group is a little more powerful than what I'm doing, then I can do X, Y, and Z, and you can get help from friends, and, it lets these players grow into that level, as opposed to now where they're not getting that chance to grow and learn and do that. They're just simply being presented with the big expensive thing, and now you're expected to perform at that level, and that can be a big ask for a new player who's trying to build decks and doesn't really quite grasp all the nuances with mana counts and making sure you've got the right percentage of each color and how much card draw and how much removal and how much of everything else. They just don't know these numbers yet, and they're not, and they don't know a lot of the cards. So we're asking them to move beyond these precons, and I think we're making that first step for them a lot harder than it should be. And I think we're seeing a lot of the new players coming in, looking at a precon and saying this is the intro level, and it's really not. I mean, you can, it's okay to build a deck that's not as good as the precon. Or if you find that I want players to be able to build their own decks and move up the levels, as opposed to now where we're asking them to build something that they may not be able to build early on, just because they just don't have the ability to do that. So it's going to be frustrating for them.
Yeah, I think they're still trying to figure out where they're going with this idea of Commander, and I'm excited to see what we do end up getting in the next couple months with those starter Commander decks, is what they're called. Yeah. So I'm excited to see where they bring not only the reprint value, but also just where they land new players, because it's hard for new players. It's hard for any players to dial back on power and optimization. But I mean, it's what we love doing is making decks dumber because it's fun.
Yes. Now, and before we go, I don't want everyone to think that, oh great, Bruce ended the podcast by dumping on precons. That's not what I'm trying to do. I think precons are an excellent way to introduce people to the format. I just wish the precons themselves were a little more powered down, and even because even though they're not, I still think that that's a good way to get people into the format. You have to introduce them to the format with some kind of a pre-constructed deck, and right now that is the option. So that is what I think you should be going with. I just want more. Give me more.
Speaking of precons, more. I'm still waiting on my precon that I ordered from the Secret Lair last December. It's been almost a year. And I'm sure by the time this episode releases, it still won't be here or even shipped. I heard rumors of it being shipped out in November. So we'll see about that.
Merry Christmas, Andy.
Oh, thank you. Merry Christmas 2021.
Yes.
So, that'll do it for us today. We're gonna go play some Magic. Thank you for listening, everyone. We're Temple of the False God, where our decks are not optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. I'm Andy.
I'm Bruce.
Thank you again for listening. Play some Magic for me, and may your fifth land be the Temple.
Bye!
Wait. Before you go, I just wanted to say thank you for listening. You can reach out to us via email at falsepodmtg@gmail.com or on Twitter at falsepodmtg. Bruce is at ManaBurned, and I'm at Andy Weekend, though you'll definitely notice I use the podcast Twitter far more often. Now that we've got you here, make sure you subscribe, rate us on whatever podcast platform you use. It helps us out. It gets us more reach. Subscribe to us on our YouTube channel. Like a video there. Leave some comments for more casual enjoyment. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back with some more timeless discussions about all things casual. So come hang out, and may your fifth land be the Temple. Bye-bye. Should I do my best, Bruce? Bye!